as I mentioned to you, and some of you heard read last night, Connie May Fowler. This is her most recent novel, How Clarissa Burden Learned to Fly. Those of you who were there last night got to hear her read certain sections from the book, including one of my favorite scenes, at least so far, I haven't finished it, The Death of the Fly.
I told you, don't assume.
Oh, okay, sorry, the fly. And today we're going to take questions and just make this sort of a discussion about writing and craft and questions you have, and go from there. You know, we want this to be a discussion, so please have questions and feel free to ask. You know, this is Connie's sixth novel, seventh book. She also writes memoir. We met, and those of you who know the workshop, she was one of my workshop leaders, so she got to do to me what I could do. At the time, we met in a writing workshop in Greece. I was looking for a writing workshop out of the country. I signed up for one on the island of Andros. It was a very nice time. We critiqued, then we would wander around the beach and go into town and have good food.
Find in Taverna we could find.
Yes.
You might have already known, but it was that trip that I learned the joys of ouzo. So
I had already encountered ouzo in Germany, but that was a much better ouzo in Greece. And so anyway, so we'll just have a discussion here. Do you want to start making an opening statement?
Sure. I feel like I'm in a Senate subcommittee. I will make my opening statement. Let's see. Where to begin? Well, it's somewhat what I said last night, that for me, writing and reading has just always been an integral part of who I am. And I come from very humble and violent beginnings. And every night my parents fought, and they were violent fights. And so my sister and I would huddle in the bedroom, and I would beg her to read to me so that I could try to escape from the violence. And so she would, and I would follow her finger down the page, and that's how I learned to read. And I think that's just organically I understood that reading and writing would save my life. And so as soon as I could, I started reading on my own, and then as soon as I could, I started writing. And I wrote everything. I read broadly. It didn't matter. I wasn't choosy. and I wrote anything. I wrote song lyrics. I wrote short stories. I wrote poems. I just had to scribble. I have a sound memory from my childhood. It's the sound of pencil on paper. And I probably drove my mom crazy. It's probably why she kept yelling at me to quit reading those damn books. Isn't that funny? I had a mom that didn't want me to read. And so, and also in books, yes, it was escape, but in books I also found role models. I figured out that not everybody lived the way we did, and that I wanted to be like the people in my books. I was also, frankly, I was real attracted to biographies. So I could read, a book called Nellie Bly, Girl Reporter, and I could believe that, okay, one day I'm going to leave this trailer and end up in New York City. And so it was just really, really incredibly important to me. And I've never, and I think part of this is from being poor. I think when you're poor, you don't know what's out there. You don't know the system. And you just get kind of shuttled around a lot. And I have been very fortunate that I've really benefited from the kindness of strangers who kind of helped me be in the right place at the right time. So when I went to graduate school, I didn't know that there were things called MFA programs. I didn't know about, for instance, the lauded, overly lauded, perhaps, Iowa Writers Workshop. I just I'm going to go to graduate school because I got married, and what am I going to do in Kansas? Go to school. And so there I was so lucky because I met this woman named Carolyn Doty, and she had, at that time I think, had 3 published novels, and she just took me under her wing, and she taught me things. She taught me something because I had story. My life had been so tumultuous and crazy, and I had paid attention. That's one thing that writers have to do, is you have to pay attention. And at one point, I'm going to back up. At one point in my childhood, things had gotten so out of hand that I just got quiet, and I didn't speak for maybe about 3 years. And that sounds like like that's a terrible thing, but actually it was wonderful because it allowed me to listen, you know, and I kind of like soaked in those voices. So I end up at University of Kansas and with this wonderful professor, and she starts really encouraging me, and there were just technical things that I had not been told. For instance, nobody had taught me about point of view. And the first story I turned in for my graduate workshop was ripped to shreds. I mean, I was just like, I am quitting school, I'm dumping this joint, and I'm finding a psychiatrist. But when I really looked at what they were saying, the criticism, it wasn't about the story I had to tell, that was the way I told it, because no one had taught me. Even through 4 years of undergraduate school and 12 years of primary school, no one had taught me point of view and how to control it and what it was. So once and believe me, I wasn't going to make that mistake again. And so once I got that, this thing just flew. And so in graduate school, I wrote a multiple point of view novel. A lot of sort of a pastiche of family memory and history. It has 9 different narrative voices. And it was my graduate thesis. I titled it Ave Urzuli, which I thought was brilliant and suited everybody at the school because they couldn't pronounce it and it didn't make sense, so they thought it had to be really brilliant. And my teacher, my professor encouraged me to send it to an agent, and I did, and she loved it. And very soon she'd sold it. And as soon as it got to a publishing house, they said, you've got to change this title, it makes no sense. And so I changed it to Sugar Cage. And that's how it happened. I mean, I didn't do the normal things. I didn't do the research to go to the right schools. But what I did do was that I did the work. You know, I kept reading, and I kept writing, and I did the work, and I took it very seriously. So, I mean, I guess the short answer, and the short summary of all that is like, you know, I think it's great if you can go to the she schools and meet all the right people, but there's another way to do it. You know, there's a whole lot to be said for just innate talent and sticking to it. And I mean, I remember when I got a conference call from my agent and editor with Sugar Cage, and I call it blurb season. It's when you send out your manuscript and hope that some famous writer will write something fabulous about the book that they can put on the cover. So they said, well, it's time, you know, to try to get blurbs. What writers do you know? And I'm like, I don't know any. And they both went simultaneously, oh, how refreshing. So, but that's how I started writing. It's just like it's what I've always done. I consider myself very fortunate. I never take it for granted. I'm always stunned when I publish a book. I'm like, I cannot believe this. I remember I had a professor from undergraduate school tell me about Sugar Cage. Well, you better enjoy this because it's your first book and you'll never have another first book experience. And I'm happy to say that's not right. I mean, if you can be that excited every time you write a book, then you're going to be always writing from that really exciting, wondrous place of creativity, that creative energy that caused you to pick up a pen in the first place or go to your computer in the first place. If you can keep that fire burning, your work will always be fresh.
Reminds me that Mary Zimmer Bradley, I think it was an intro to my story or one other story, said, getting published is one of the few joys in life that is neither immoral nor fattening. So,
you're crazy.
But still a pleasure. So maybe a question.
So for your first book, Sugar Cage, you didn't do the synopsis and chapters and all that. You just sent your whole manuscript on recommendation.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting. I'm in a novel class right now. He's very adamant that you send the letter and you send your synopsis and you send the first 3 chapters if they want that. And you know, there's this whole process. So
I think there is a process today. And now, you know, with the world of the internet, I mean, we didn't have email. This was in 1990, and we didn't have email. So I just, what she did was, my professor, she gave me a list of 5 names. She said, I really want you to send this out. And I had no self-confidence, no self-esteem. I thought that she was crazy. But it's like, well, but I was a good student. A part of me was always willing to try, even though I had terrible self-esteem, I was still willing to try. It was like a dichotomy that I still possess to this day. And so she sent me a list. She gave me a list of 5 names, and she said, when the first one rejects it, you just send that right back out and send it to the second name on the list. And I didn't do that. I decided to rely on good luck. And so I looked at the list and I tried to divine which person would bring me good luck. This is not how you do it, okay? And the third name on the list was Joy. And I'm like, well, that's obvious. And so I just sent off to this lady named Joy. And in the meantime, I had applied and gotten into law school. So that was my plan, because I was tired of studying English literature and thought that being a lawyer would be a good idea. And so, but she loved it. And literally, I think it was about a month, she sold it to an editor at Putnam, had been her Vonnegut's editor, and her name was Faith. So I'm like, well, I'm just gonna keep this ball rolling. but yeah, but now with the internet, you can go online and find out what agents' guideline submissions are. And so my agent's guideline submissions are now, I think she's even, if you write a great letter about what your book is about, they'll say, yeah, show us more, but they'll want like 3 chapters.
About how long does it take you to finish a novel? And when do you realize it's finished?
That's a great question. Well, you know, when I'm not teaching, I can usually, and I'm just writing, I can write a novel in 2 to 3 years. But it's longer now that I'm teaching, because you just don't have the luxury of sitting in the back cave all day. And I think that novels are like symphonies. I think they're very, very akin to symphonies, and I think the construction is similar. And so it's something about the ear. You know, you hear it. You hear that it's the ending, and you feel it in your whole body too. I wish that there was a formula, or, you know, okay, when this happens on this day in your life, you will know that your novel is done. Or on the 45th day, they're always done. I mean, wouldn't that be great? But it doesn't work that way. And also, it depends on your process. Like for me, I tend to know the beginning and at least an ending image. I mean, I've written a ton of poetry in my life, and I really consider the novels long-form poems. And so I'll write to the closing image. And so, and after all that work, you know whether that closing image is really where you're going or not. And so when you get it there, you know.
How do you decide what your novels are going to be about?
It's whatever won't let you sleep at night. It just won't let you go. It's kind of a divine obsession. You know, and it might be a character. Instead of a story plot, it might be a character who just is walking around in your head. You know, and so as the character walks around in your head, you come to know him or her and figure out what their story is. Or maybe it's an instant. Edward P. Jones wrote The Known World, which I think is widely considered a modern masterpiece. And he had worked for this little publication in Washington, D.C. called Tax Notes, and that's what he did for a living. He wrote these incredibly boring columns about tax law. But some point in his life, he was doing some reading for himself, and he read that there had actually been, not very many, but in the American South, there had actually been some African American slaveholders, and this just totally haunted him. And it just shook him to his core. So he walked around with this idea in his head for 10 years, just walking around, working it out in his head. And they knew he liked to write. So the people at Tax Notes gave him this old, probably Russian-made computer. And he was going to finally take a vacation. After he'd never taken any of his vacation time. So he has a month of vacation. So he takes his first vacation. He gets up the morning of vacation day 1, phone call comes, we're downsizing, sorry, don't come back to work, but you've got 30 days severance. And he said, well, then that means I've got 30 days to write this novel. And he did it. I mean, and this thing is incredible, but he had walked around with it in his head for 10 years. I mean, I'm sure there was editing and stuff down the line, but that initial whoop was just there. But so that was his obsession. So it comes from all different sources. Sometimes it's something that happens in the world. Sometimes it's something that happened to you that you just have to tell the tale. And sometimes, you know, it's just somebody got in your head.
Alex, first you have a question.
Speaking of things getting in your head, have you ever written something that was successful, maybe over the course of a year or two, and then some days you'll look at it and just be so discouraged that, you know, that this is completely unworthy of publication?
Every
or-
day, that's the process.
It just seems so abnormal to me, and it's nice to hear.
Yeah, and it's also one of the reasons why I'm very cognizant now of paying attention to my moods and how tired I am and what time of day I might go in to look at work, because if I'm really tired and it's 9 or 10 o'clock at night, I will think that everything I wrote that day was absolute horrible, just junk. And so, and if I'm just, you know, if I've got the blues and I'm reading the work and you'll just think it's terrible and I want to throw it all out, I've been at it long enough that I have a growing voice in my head saying, no, just wait. Look at it again when you're in a better frame of mind. But also, I think that it's one of the things that writers have to live with, and I think it makes us better writers, is self-doubt. I mean, if we were arrogant enough to think every word we put down on the page was absolutely brilliant and didn't have to be changed, you know, we would just be an arrogant asshole. You know?
Because I edited for a magazine for a while, and I noticed there was sort of a correlation how arrogant the cover letter was to how bad the story was. If somebody was telling me this was the most, this was literary genius, besides the fact that we were a small press magazine, this was just a wonderful thing, and it was the best thing since so and so, chances are I was going to not get through the first paragraph.
Yeah, which also speaks to cover letters. I mean, my agent, I've been on panels with her. She always gets the question about what do you want in a cover letter, and her first thing is, don't tell me how good it is. They want to make that determination, you know, for themselves. But yeah, I mean, in your own work, have you? I mean, it sounds like you have at times. You've written stuff and it was good, and then you look back, and just for some reason, all that doubt came in.
Constantly.
Yeah. Well, write on your good days, read on your good days. On your bad days, go see a film.
What are your thoughts on things like National Novel Writing Month that's going on right now? Have you heard
I
about it?
didn't even know it.
It's this program that goes on online, and there are forums and everything where authors can talk. And basically, we're given the month of November to finish a novel. And so it's just
Supposed to write a novel and.
yeah, it's meant to be based on like length and not perfection. So just kind of to get you in the swing of things.
But you know, it's like everything. I mean, I think if it builds awareness and excitement, that's a good thing. You know, if it builds community, that's even a better thing. I mean, what we do is so solitary
Yeah.
that we really do have to have this kind of network of like-minded nutbags that we can go to for comfort and solace. And so yeah, to that extent, I think it's great. I mean, I think if anybody's going to go into it thinking that they're going to have a polished novel in 30 days, they're probably not. But anything that excites people and creates community is a wonderful thing. There's all kinds of initiatives out there about the novel and writing now that didn't used to be there. I don't see a downside, really.
It's my first year participating, which is why I thought about it.
What's it been like for you?
I've got about 5,000 words, so not really absolutely wonderful so far,
But it's prompting you to write.
yeah, definitely. If you sit down every day and do something, I've found it's pretty inspirational, especially since you have the support system.
So what's the online community like?
There are forums for like character development, plot development, ideas for that. You can go on and ask people, what they think about a certain idea, and you'll get feedback. And there's a regional forum where you can go in, like there's one for Cincinnati where they have like meetups for writing, and things like that. So I haven't been to any of those, but in theory, I think it sounds really cool.
Yeah.
You said that, you know, you're writing and even reading, it's affected by your mood at that exact moment. Do you have any sort of ritual or habit that seems to work with you? For most of the time, is there a time of day that's easiest to write, or a place, or is it easier to write only at your house, or is it easier to write on the road? Do you have any sort of ritual that's...
Yeah, I think that it's important that you have a place, sort of like your little altar, you know, and that you go to at the same time of day. I've tried to write on airplanes, and it just was really bad. It was like, okay, let me burn these pages. but I have my little space, and I have all my little things around it, and I work best in the morning. But also what I realize that I do is I tend to, well, I have a shadow book with every book I write, which means it's a book that I keep going back to give me hope and bolster me and teach me. So for How Clarissa Burton Learned to Fly, my shadow book was Mrs. Dalloway. And so I would just get up in the morning afraid that I was not going to be able to pull it off that day. And I would open up the pages of Mrs. Dalloway and start reading, and at first be absolutely blown away by what Virginia Woolf accomplished on that page. And then soon just got pulled down into the narrative and into the magic of the words, and kind of in this place where you need to be, I think, as a writer. And then suddenly it'd be like, okay, I'm ready. And what I've gotten into is the habit of first rereading the previous day's work and rewriting that, and in the afternoon I'm writing new material. It's been a good way to work for me because I'm always completely immersed in the story. I'm not coming at it from outside the story. I'm always coming at it from within the story. I used to just, and I probably will do this again. With some projects, it's just like, I have just got to get this down on paper, willy-nilly, just get it down, and it's just a bleh. You know, and then I go and revise. But lately I've been doing it the opposite way. I still revise incessantly, but going in and dipping back into that world and then moving forward. Dip back in, move forward.
I know in Clarissa you use a lot of local folklore and legends. I know you use mythology. I know some students here are taking mythology as well as interested in it. So you talk a little bit about how you incorporate legends and folklore and those types of things in your story. What place do you see them in your writing?
I think they're really, I had a real mythological childhood. I mean, you know, there were ghosts all around all the time, and every time something happened, you know, somebody in the family would decide that it was a ghost and stuff like that. Plus, everybody was dead too, so maybe that contributed to it. But I've just always been really fascinated by mythology and religions. I mean, so I'd come home, you know, hey Mom, I'm a Muslim. Then I'd come back 2 days later, hey Mom, I'm a Jew. It's just never into. But I would be really devout and really study. Hey, I'm a Roman pantheist. So it was just something I've always been interested in, and I think it's because I've always been interested in story and narrative and how that works in our lives. And so that's the basis of mythology, is story and narrative and how it works in our lives. So it's naturally just a part of my own work. But the caution on all of that is that it has to rise organically from the action and from the characters. You don't want to impose the mythology. It's got to be woven in so that it's seamless. Is that?
Other questions?
You mentioned earlier that you have a beginning and an ending picture in mind when you start writing. Do you write in order, like start to finish, chronologically, or do you jump?
I try to, yeah. I think it's really dangerous to write out of order. I mean, I only say that because right now I've got about 3 students who are trying to write memoir, and they're all writing out of order, and what they're getting, it's just a mess. It's just a mess. And so, because they don't know what came before it or what, there's something really elegant about just starting at the beginning. Just start at the beginning and tell the story. And with this book, I had written about 50 pages, and I kept rewriting those first 50 pages, and I couldn't seem to stop. And so I sent them to a friend of mine who was a poet and said, tell me what's going on here. And he said, you've written the entire book in 50 pages. I'm like, oh my God, you're right. And so with this book, my goal, my challenge was I had to attenuate the 50 into an entire novel. But I think the books tend, I mean, you can do it, you can do anything, and everybody's process is different, but the risk you run when you write in scenes in isolation is that they won't feel organic. It won't feel like an organic whole. So if you are writing out of order, it's important that when you go in to revise, you really look for that kind of feeling of unity, that it all really does work together, that it doesn't feel like, oh, that chapter must have been written, you know.
Have you ever used, I read in the 2005 edition of The Writer that, I don't remember which author it was, but she takes time to, she's a procrastinator, and she takes time to, she has a scrapbook or a character Bible, and she scribbles down character outlines, stuff that you won't even need to have anything to do with characterization, because she believes that it's so important in her story. And I just thought that almost like, on a selfish point of view, I thought that seemed so fun, like, because I like to procrastinate, and I had that anxiety, and I just thought that was, and I've been doing that for just about everything I've written, and I'm not really sure if it's helped my writing or anything, but I was just wondering, have you taken time to just...
Yeah, I have files on characters, some who will probably never show up, but I say, oh wow, that's interesting. And so I think it's really important, you know, that you start building. I keep image journals where it's just piled up with interesting things that I've, you know, all the senses, you know, so that I can tap back in to go, oh, that would be really interesting for this character to have this trait or whatever. And just things, I keep news clippings of what's strange and bizarre. And big files on. I also have an eavesdropping file. I get some of my greatest inspiration from listening in on other people's conversations. People are crazy.
Sorry, I just flashed back to our first night at the hotel at Andrews.
What?
I don't remember.
Who were eavesdropping on?
There was this lady sitting next to us, and floating out of the conversation was, I'm not trying to remember the exact wording was, something about small penis. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. I'm like, did he just say small penis?
Because our conversation had just hit this lull when this phrase came over. And actually, Connie was giving us exercises to do we were writing, and it was postcards, and the first thing we do was something you over here in a bar, and that's right.
That's right.
I think it was there's nothing wrong with a man with a small penis, or something along those lines. It was just like, okay, that's an interesting thing to overhear in a bar.
Oh, you
and
can,
random.
I assigned a class of mine to go out into the world, listen, and then come in with something amazing that you eavesdropped on. And they did, but I actually won the contest because I walked into the grocery store that had a Starbucks in it, and I overheard the barista say, everything was going just fine until I found the garlic butter in my underwear.
Wow.
Yeah.
I remember when you posted that on Facebook.
And so the class, that was the opening line, and so the class, we did a group story where we just, and we call it the garlic butter underwear blues. But yeah, and you can call it procrastination, or you can talk about, you know, all the very important journals you keep.
Yeah. I would like to equivocate it as a good thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I start with the beginning, I start off with a great start, then I get to the middle, and suddenly I'm not sure how to get to the ending. It's sort of like knowing where you're beginning and knowing your destination, but you don't have a roadmap. I don't know. Well, what do you think of that?
Middle suck. They really are. And I think that one of the things that you have to do is always go back to the story. I mean, what are your elements? You know, what's already on the page, and where, you know, and what's at stake. You know, something's got to be at stake. This character has to be up against conflict all the time. And if you can start to answer those questions and start to see the possibilities, then you're gonna move that novel forward to the end.
I've taken a novel class now, we're writing something, and I have a character that I put in my novel that he isn't really cooperating very well. Do you ever just axe characters and leave them out if you can't move them along the way you want to?
Why don't you let him do what he wants to do?
Well, I just can't quite figure out, I had this big plan and it's just so messy. He's so messy, and I don't know, I'm a control freak, I guess, I don't know. But it's bothering me, so I'm thinking about just completely cutting him out and letting the novel continue without him, which it could. But have you ever?
What's his role in the novel?
Well, he's eventually gonna be the President of the United States, but he's just a puppet. So I'm thinking of axing him and just,
So he's not important to him?
well, I don't know. Have you ever run up against that, and do you ever just delete characters if you can't get them where you want? Or?
No.
No, okay, we'll work it out.
But I always like it when the character's finally in control, because very often in the early days of a novel, I'm driving it, because I'm learning what it's about, and then lo and behold, one day they go, move over, we're driving it. And then the novel really starts to pop. You know, it becomes its own real and valid universe rather than me trying to be the one telling them what to do. It becomes so fully formed that they're running the show. So I don't know if that's what this character's doing or not.
Probably need to let go a little bit.
But what I do see very often is there just might be too many characters on the page, and it hurts people to do it, but it's like, okay, these two characters are extraneous. Why are they here? Well, then collapse them into one character. But you're talking about something else where he just won't get in lockstep with your vision. Is that right?
I think so, yes.
Well, maybe, what if you just let him be who he is?
I will try that. See how it goes.
And maybe he needs his own book. Maybe that's not his novel.
Yeah, okay.
My question is, going back to the whole idea of like keeping files and characters on stuff. When you have an ideal of a character and you're trying to put them into a story, how do you get them to actually transition to that? Because for me, I always have an idea of how that character is, but when I have them associated with other characters, I get afraid that my characters are all seeming too much like the same. And so my question is there like tricks to like creating differences between characters? Like, I mean more than physical, like attitudes and stuff like that.
Well, I think that you have to, go back to the file, and you have like a character dossier on each one. You know, it can help you create that character, and so, you know, yeah, what did they look like, but what's their background? If you think of like how you react in the world to a specific situation, you're going to react to it not just because, it's something we talked about last night, not just because of the situation, but because of all the things that have ever happened to you in your life. But he's going to react differently in that same situation because of all the things that's happened to him in his life. You two speak differently. So how do your characters speak? Where are they from? What's happened to them? You know, everybody in here is unique. And so each one of your characters, because they're human, are going to be unique. Even if they're not human, even if they're demons or fairies or whatever the case might be, you still have to imbue them with their own unique humanity. And so, you know, start writing down a list. You know, sit around and people watch and go, oh, I bet he would have that kind of hair, those kind of jaws, and have, you know, a slight Icelandic accent. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
How do you determine your shadow books? Is it just like a feeling?
Yeah, you know, I think that in the early days of Clarissa, the shadow book was Love in the Time of Cholera, but the book changed, so the shadow book had to change.
So is the feeling that you get from that book's like something that you try to emulate within your own novel, or is it just kind of to inspire you?
I think it's both. I mean, one of the things that goes on in Mrs. Dalloway, and I didn't even realize it. I think I realize everything in my subconscious, and so I'm just not consciously aware, but that book takes place in a 24-hour period, and this book takes place in a 24-hour period. But when I started this book, I wanted it to do that, but I was afraid. So I kept writing a longer book, and once I made the decision to just go ahead and try it, the book really started to cook. So I could look at her book from that angle, but also just inside this head of a woman who's walking down the street, and you're suddenly getting both what's happening in the moment, you're getting information about the era, you're getting information about the war and politics and people's history. I mean, it's astonishing what she does in like the first 50 pages of that book. And so that was something I wanted to learn from and wanted to approach in this book. With Sugar Cage, because I had no idea what I was doing. And so I basically bunkered myself into my little apartment and read about 30 books in 30 days because I wanted to try to internalize the form. So, because I thought if I could just internalize the form, I might not have to stop and start so many times. And then I ran across a novel. In that process, I ran across a novel called Love Medicine by Louise Erdrich. And some people say it's not a novel, but a cycle of short stories. But when I read these different stories from these different characters' points of view that all led to a conclusion, I was like, oh, I can do it. I can do that. I can't have one character talking the whole time, but I can do that. And so that became my shadow book, because for lots of reasons, but it also gave me courage. But you ought to look at your library as like a medicine cabinet. It's like, all right, I'm not doing so well on dialogue today, but so-and-so's dialogue is amazing. Let me take that off the shelf. I mean, your books will teach you how to write.
You mentioned earlier the sound and the pencil and the paper is sounds really stay with you. And you said sort of how you have a start and you have a sense of the end. Is there, when you sort of imagine a scene or the ending, you have sort of even a sense that, like particularly like sight, sounds, smells, you have something that you respond mostly to or helps you shape the story? Like, do you have a strong image of what it looks like for the characters, or do you have the sounds of their voices more, or is it sort of a mix of all of the
I think
different
it's a
senses?
mix of everything, but it's also, I think you develop an innate, and I think if you read a lot, you will develop this innate sense of rise and fall of action and moving it forward, and just the right, I call them buttons, just the right button on the end of the scene that makes that a complete work within a larger work. Normally the scene's going to somehow move it forward into the next, but not necessarily real obviously, but it usually has to do, I think, with sensory data. Sensory data are a moment of interiority that gives context to the story. I mean, we're always told show, don't tell, which is true, except you have to have some exposition. You have to have some, and that exposition serves to contextualize the action. Does that make sense? And so, but it's really, I mean, I wish there was a formula, but there's not. Is that you feel it. You feel like, okay, this has just come to this really interesting conclusion, and it gives me a great place to move into the next part of the story. But it's not formulaic. But I can't urge y'all enough to really be aware of infusing your narratives with a lot of sensory data, and I mean not just visual, but the whole shebang. And when you're writing dialogue, don't have page after page after page of strung dialogue, but as two people are talking, use all those other elements of fiction, you know, action, interiority, sensory data, because otherwise what you end up with are two disembodied voices on the page just yakking at each other.
You mentioned earlier that like you wrote a memoir inspired by your life and how it's very tumultuous. How did you organize all of the events in your life to write them down in like a chronological, like you said, elegant form that made sense? Because if, you know, just for personal experience, my life's like all over the place and I just wouldn't be able to like organize all of those events and make it, you know, awesome without maybe 10 years of work.
Right, well, structure, whether it's memoir or fiction, or creative nonfiction, whatever, is just incredibly important. That's why, you know, when I figured out that this book needed to take place in a 24-hour period, oh my gosh, now I have my structure, you know, and the rest is sort of easy. But with the memoir, it was actually an explored, I was for about 5 years involved in this incredibly abusive relationship, so it explores how I got out of that relationship. But it also, because I wanted people to understand how I ended up there and why I stayed for as long as I did, I would have sections from my childhood. And so, as a result, I'm sort of in the present moment of the abuse, and then I create a word bridge, page break, and then I'm in a moment from my childhood that the effect is to illustrate and to let the reader understand what happened to me as a childhood that propelled me to be in the place I was in the present moment of the memoir. So that's how I did it, you know.
That makes sense.
And so it had a real reason and a rhyme, you know. There was a rhythm to, okay, this is happening in my present moment life. This is what happened in my childhood. Present moment life, childhood. But they were carefully chosen moments from childhood to illustrate. It wasn't just random. Choices we make are very, very important, you know. Not every detail is important. It might be important to your life, but within that structure of that particular book, you have to figure out which ones are the ones that have to be in there.
Something that I think I mentioned here, I know I mentioned my graduate class too, I keep getting, you guys don't do it as much as actually my graduate students have been doing it. Well, I know people who this really happened to, I know this is what it's really like. And I said, but that's life. This is fiction. And fiction is a construct. And even creative nonfiction and memoir is a construct.
It is a construct.
And you have to construct it so it's not going, because like you said, if you wrote your life or even a story how life really happens, it wouldn't make sense because our lives are everywhere and there is no structure most days. Or if it is, it's a boring structure. I mean, oh, I went to class. Class was over.
You know,
I went to class.
the alarm went off, I opened my eyes, I groaned, I hit the alarm, I went back to sleep. I mean, that's not a book.
Yeah. So just keep this in mind that just, you know, again, that just because you know somebody that's happened to or things like that doesn't make it actually always work, even in memoir or fiction. You have to construct it to make it work in many ways.
You're making, in memoir or fiction, it doesn't matter, creative nonfiction of any sort, you're still creating works of art. And why are we creating works of art? Because we're contextualizing our lives into this wonderful package that will make sense to our readers. You know, we want a reader to be able to pick up the book and go, oh, wow. Not be able to put it down and to understand, have a heightened sense of awareness of what it is, of what that experience is that you put down on paper. And so, and I teach a lot of creative nonfiction these days, and that's one of the primary things I have to do is to give my students permission to, they're not lying, but they are reshaping so that it makes sense within the world of the book. And you'll see a lot of forewords in memoirs these days going, this isn't exactly the way it happened, because, you know, because they feel like they need a disclaimer, which I understand, especially in the days of James Fry and people completely fabricating. But you still have to, you know, give it a shape. And so maybe you know, these series of catastrophic events happened over a series of 20 years, and you've created a scene where you've distilled the experience into one scene. You know, that's kind of an exaggeration, but that's where.
I get, like, I believe like every person has their own individual ambitions for going to whatever field they go into. Like my field is media, and I know like I want to, like my one goal is to tell other people's stories. So what is like, I guess your primary goal being a writer in your life? Like what is that driving force that says, you know what, I want to get my stories out there? Like is it an inspiration like to inspire other people to do the same thing, or is it like this ticking time bomb, like every time you think of a story, like it's just waiting to explode, and then it's like you can't help it?
I think that's such a great question, and I think it's a multi-tiered answer. That one, I love telling stories. I just love it. I love the whole process. It's not to say the process is easy, but that act of, I mean, if you think about it, everything in the world, I mean, we put so much emphasis on science and stuff, and that's all great, and we need it, but the world really runs by narrative. You know, if that scientist isn't able to tell a story to the guy who's going to invest in the technology, that technology's never going to come about. So everything actually is fueled not by fossil fuels, but by narrative. And so, it's maybe, you mean, it's just part and parcel, like you were saying, you know, your thing is that you know, you want to be in media and to find out, learn other people's stories and bring that about. My thing is, you know, it's the same thing, except mine's on paper. I get the sense that you're talking about doing like other kinds of media, right?
I want to be a documentary maker. So.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. So I'm so interested in story and narrative, and I want to express that. But then on another level, I'm very, very interested in the art and craft of expressing those stories. So it's not just the story themselves. Then you've got to learn how to tell it, and the best way to tell it. So as you go forward as a documentary filmmaker, you're really interested in these people's stories, but then how best to tell the story on film. You know, we have to learn the whole shebang kind of together. And we have to have that excitement. We have to have that passion to tell the tale, and then we have to have the passion of, okay, what are our tools to tell it? Does that make sense?
It does.
What have you found to be the hardest part about writing a novel?
It's the two things, self-doubt and time. You know, just to flick that little evil demon off my shoulder when it keeps telling me, that's no good, you can't do it, you saw it. And get, you know, being disciplined, having the time. Graduate school is a wonderful thing and school is a wonderful thing because you have to get the work done in a certain period of time. You have a deadline, and then, you know, as life goes forward, then all these other things impinge that are time stealers, and I think that writers have to be we're told all the time not to be selfish, but if we're going to get our work done, we have to be selfish, and so we have to be very selfish and claim stretch of time for ourselves, because books don't write themselves.
You mentioned titles before with the having to change the title of the first novel. And this is something, because we've talked about titles in class, and I'm just curious, you know, when do you start with your title? Do you start early? Do you come up with it afterwards?
It's always different, I think. Hopefully it rises organically from the story itself, I mean, rather than being imposed. With Sugar Cage, I mean, Abe Erzuli is an absolute perfect title for that book, except that nobody knows how to say it, and they don't know what it means. So what I did was, and nobody was going to go for it, so I started kind of free writing, title, just like sometimes how you start to write poetry. And the second I wrote down Sugar Cage, I just knew. It was like, you know, hair goes up on your back, you're like, oh my God, that's it. And with River of Hidden Dreams, which I still don't like that title. I wanted it to be called Listening for Light. And it just, suddenly I had editors and agents in my life, and they were fighting over it. I'm like, the book hasn't even been written. With Clarissa, I think the title was almost there before anything else. I wasn't sure how she was going to fly. I knew she was going to, but I wasn't sure how she was going to. And I like the way she flies, which I can't tell you because you haven't gotten to it. And that book was originally going to be called This Experiment I Call My Life, which is a title I still love. But pretty soon in, I figured out that this was an omniscient point of view, which just completely surprised me. And it meant that I had to abandon that title, because that title is a first-person point of view title. So, but I love the title so much that I attached it to the new book I'm writing. And it's just not working out either. So I don't know. One day I'm gonna have a book called This Experiment I Call My Life, but right now, it's just not working out for me.
Any other questions? A few more minutes, but
Is there any suggestions you have for somebody who wants to get published?
Right. You gotta have the writing done. And it's also good to, which is not what I did, but it's not a bad idea to there are some really good writing conferences where usually they're ones you have to apply to get into. And you're working with published working writers, and they also usually bring in editors and agents, and that allows you to really understand what is happening in writing today and who's helping make that happen. And so when you write that cover letter, you can say, and I attended Bread Lunch 3 times, or da-da-da-da. And I mean, those things actually help your portfolio, as it were. But the main thing is the work.
Right. Is there ever a time when you actually were able to publish something unsolicited? Or is it pretty much all done through literary agencies?
I think that's changing a little bit now because of electronic publishing and self-publishing, but I think the major houses still want everything agented. It's pretty important. Your agent is your #1 advocate. They really, and one of the things you don't want to get into, if you can avoid it, is being involved in the financial business end of what's going to happen with this work of art, because for you it's a work of art, and an agent is seeing it as money. And unfortunately, editors will also see it as money. And there's a relationship that the agent wants everything they can get, and the editor, because now they're part of a megalopolis corporation, wants to give as little as possible. And you're in the middle, and your work is in the middle. So agents help traverse that really, really tricky terrain. And they also do a lot of, they're your #1 advocate. They're out there on your behalf on a lot of different fronts. So if you can get an agent, that's really, really great. Did you want to talk about research?
if you just talk about that, what kind of research do you do for each novel, or?
I do a lot of research. I think it's an immense creative engine, and now with the internet, I mean, it used to be like with Sugarcane, if I was gonna research something, I had to, actually go to the physical building, call the library. And now, as I'm writing, I can go, oh, I wonder about, well, what would that specific car be? And what special attributes might it have had? What made it special? Or what would be that? What would be growing in that sand in that place at that time of year? And as I'm writing, I'm researching, and it's creating a really interesting synergy, I think, between being accurate and specific and being creative. but I can't do enough research usually.
Along with your shadow books, do you actually sometimes have like the research book or like the nonfiction books next to you, or
Yeah,
within
like
hands that you
with,
can look at?
The problem with Murmur Lee, she's actually, well, she's sort of murdered. I know that sounds weird, that you're either murdered or you're not, but she was sort of murdered. She was at least neglected. And so I needed to find a way that how someone could die, how murder could be committed, and it really be pretty much untraceable. So I got one of those cheesy books about 25 ways to kill a person.
Well,
It's a great book.
And this is one of the bad things about being a writer, when you got these, if somebody starts looking at your nonfiction selections on your bookshelves and sees, deadly doses and,
Yeah.
and the Writer's Guide to Poisons and things
That's
like
right.
this, and you're kind of looking at you like, how come you know all these things are poisonous?
But depending on the book, you're going to have like a little arsenal of nonfiction research that you're looking at. And it can really give depth and context, and it can drive plot too, if you know these things. It's hard to write if you're empty-headed. So if you fill up that knowledge base, the stories start to gain a depth and an energy that they would lack otherwise.
And you already mentioned, like you said, sometimes you find interesting facts that you just have to write about, like the African Americans that held slaves. And I know a friend of mine wrote a story about Mississippi had traveling executioners.
Oh my gosh.
They actually
Of
brought.
course they did.
They actually had a truck with an electric chair on the back of it, and so he wound up writing a story about this traveling executioner.
Itinerant executioner.
Yeah, they would come to town for the
Oh.
and so so you never know when you're going to find an interesting fact, and like you said, that it gets in your head,
Yeah.
and you have to write about it because
Well,
it's just
in
an
this
odd
book,
thing.
one of the first things I did was, I was reading about pre-Civil War Florida history, and I came across, this sounds very dry, I came across this thing called the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. And Florida was a Spanish territory twice, and its last incarnation is a Spanish territory. Spain could be very brutal, but they could be very progressive. And in Florida, for that time, they were progressive. So there wasn't any slavery. Black men could sit on juries. And women could own property. And none of these things existed in the American colonies. None of it. And so with the 1819 treaty, Spain ceded Florida to the United States. And it would be 2 years hence. So in 1821, in April of a certain date, I don't remember the date, Florida became a part of the United States. And this meant that these people who lived in Florida, who had been living in relative freedom, who owned property, suddenly all of that, because of a real estate deal, was gone. And I thought, oh my God, but what if you were living, because you wouldn't know, there was no internet. You're living in the middle of nowhere, Florida, you don't have a newspaper, there's no communication. So they wouldn't have even known that on that day, they no longer had rights to be treated as full human beings. And so I started creating a story in my head of a woman and her family. And then I decided I didn't want to do historical fiction. So they became a ghost family in the book. But all of that, the things that such an event prompt ended up being the backbone of the book. So the whole impetus of the book, the original idea for the book, all stemmed from some random research I was doing.
Call it an end here. And thank you. And you can remind everybody we'll be back to workshops on Tuesday. But thank you very much, Connie, for
Thank you.
your time
Oh,
today.
wonderful.